the recording now. So I'll start with introductions. Okay, we're being recorded. Okay, I'll start with introductions. We'll let people filter in, and then we'll turn to your remarks. So I am very happy to welcome all of you, and I'm delighted that the four of you have agreed to participate in this panel. I'll start with introductions, and then we will turn to comments from each of the panelists, and then Q&A as more participants filter in, and then for those who watch this online later, hopefully someone will ask the questions that you had thought to ask had you been here in person. So first, we have Ambassador Pham Quan Vinh, who joins us from Hanoi, where he is Senior Advisor at the Asia Group. Previously, Ambassador Vinh had a long and distinguished career with Vietnam's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where he achieved the highest rank possible for a career diplomat of Senior Ambassador. I won't name all his positions because that would take too long, but he rose through the ranks of the MFA's Department of International Organizations, serving ultimately as Deputy Director General from 1995 to 2003. He served twice with Vietnam's permanent mission to the UN in New York, with the Embassy of Vietnam in Thailand, and as the 5th Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of Vietnam to the US from 2015 to 18. Prior to that role, from 2011 to 14, he served as Deputy Minister of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in charge of relations with countries in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and the South Pacific, and as Vietnam's senior official to the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. He later returned as senior advisor to the MFA ahead of Vietnam's accession to the ASEAN chairmanship in 2020. This past December, he was also elected to a 5-year term as president of the Vietnam-US Society to promote diplomatic ties. And he's a graduate of the University of Foreign Affairs in Hanoi and the Canberra College of Advanced Education in Australia. Frank Januzzi is currently President and Chief Executive Officer of the Mansfield Foundation, where he's been since 2014. He previously served as Deputy Executive Director for Advocacy Policy and Research at Amnesty here in the US. Prior to that, he was Policy Director for East Asia and Pacific Affairs for the US Senate Foreign Relations Committee from 1997 to 2012. In that role, Mr. Januzzi advised committee chairs Joseph Biden and John Kerry on a range of security, political, economic, and human rights issues pertinent to US relations with East Asia. Overlapping with that period from 2006 to 2007, he was a Hitachi Fellow of the Council on Foreign Relations, a visiting lecturer at Keio University, and a visiting scholar at the Institute of International Policy Studies in Tokyo. Prior to all that, early in his career, he served for 9 years as an analyst at the US Department of State's Bureau of Intelligence and Research. And earlier still, Mr. Januzzi earned his BA from Yale and his MPP from Harvard's JFK School of Government. Sidney Jones is founder of and senior advisor to the Jakarta-based Institute for Policy Analysis of Conflict. There, and in over a decade with the International Crisis Group previously, she is focused on Islamist extremism, insurgency, and conflict in Southeast Asia, with a particular focus on Indonesia and the Philippines. With the International Crisis Group, Sidney Jones served as Southeast Asia Project Director and as Senior Advisor to the Asia Program. The Crisis Group in that time became known as the go-to authority for studies of Jemaah Islamiyah, linkages between Indonesian and Filipino extremists, and ethno-nationalist conflicts in Aceh, Papua, and Mindanao. Earlier still, Ms. Jones worked in chronological order with the Ford Foundation in Jakarta and New York, with Amnesty International in London as the Indonesia, Philippines, Pacific researcher, and Human Rights Watch in New York as the Asia director. She has been a visiting fellow at the Australian National University in Canberra, the University of California at Berkeley, and the Central European University in Budapest, and has numerous publications that I won't name. Ms. Jones earned BA and MA degrees from the University of Pennsylvania and received an honorary doctorate in 2006 from the New School in New York. Last but certainly not least, Dr. Prashant Parameswaran is a fellow with the Wilson Center's Asia program, where he produces analysis on Southeast Asian political and security issues, Asian defense affairs, and US foreign policy in the Asia Pacific. He's also Deputy Head of Research at the consultancy Bauer Group Asia and senior columnist at the Diplomat, which is one of Asia's leading current affairs publications. He's also the author of a new book, Elusive Balances, Shaping US Southeast Asia Strategy, just out this year, which examines US commitment in Southeast Asia over the past half century and offers policy recommendations for future administrations. A political scientist by training, Dr. Parameswaran is a recognized expert on Asian affairs, security, and US foreign policy in the region, with a focus on Southeast Asia. He's conducted field research across the region, consulted for companies and governments, and taught courses, and he publishes widely in the US and Asia in leading publications and journals. Dr. Parameswaran holds a PhD and MA from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts. All right. So with our illustrious panel here, we will jump right into it. So we'll start with you, Ambassador Vin.
So my honor to be here, and I thank you very much for the invitation and also for the introduction. I was offered the topic on the theme, working in foreign affairs at national versus regional level, also versus non-governmental position. So I would love to share my experiences, and it looks like I'm coming back to the old days, being a student of foreign affairs and then become a diplomat and now a retired one. So my first point would be being a diplomat is not not quite what you see on TV or talk of, not so glamorous or dress up as always. It's a nice job, but tough job and hard work. A simple definition of being a diplomat can be something like you represent your nation in external environment, trying to achieve your national interests. But one thing I will tell you, to do so, you need the support from home. Your home country will be very much important. So your representation as a diplomat starts first from home, at home. And very much often this will be the toughest part of your job. Now, on the question of national versus regional level, at both levels, I see you have to advocate and build support and consensus, both at the regional level and at the national level. Now, at the national, but they have something the same, but at the same time, they have something different. At the national level, you have to bring what I see as regional input into the domestic perspective and sell your points. This is very difficult sometimes. Your priorities at home to the people, to the government are quite different from the regional priorities. So you have to bring those to your country. And then you have to coordinate with agencies and certainly with different parties at home to arrive at some support or consensus so that you can make a policy. At the regional level, it is a way around. You have to bring national input into the regional perspective. And then you have to sell your points to the region. Your national interests have to be shared with the region. And then you have to coordinate, not with the agencies at home, but with the external governments and representatives. This is a new context and environment for you to interact between you as a representative of your country and representative of other countries. So at each level, it is unique, but at the same time, it has something different. And you have different ways to approach it. But I must tell you later on how my experience shows that we have to do at home and at the regional level. Another point I want to share with you is about regional policy, something I call it first thing first. In order to develop a regional policy and carrying it out, you have to do first. That is to know your home country, your own policy and interests. If you compare notes between the regional aspirations and your home country interests, then there's a job for you to change the pattern of thinking back home. Sometimes it's very much difficult. People are focusing on daily lives, on job, on employment, on healthcare, on education. But out there, you need to give your money, for example, to education of other people, to assist other people, to discuss other issues, not quietly of the national concern. That is the point that you have to think. And how you can change the pattern of thinking back home is very much important. And it influences your ways of interacting between you, a representative at the national level, in the regional context. The second point, you need to know your home and work at home. is to raise the region's profile at home. This is very much important. Sometimes Southeast Asia is not something known to many people in the US, for example. So you have to do that by yourself or your ministry or your department. And finally, you are part of advocating the regional policy of your own country. That is how you know your country and your policy. Second point, or first thing first for regional policy, is what I call it, to understand the region. The region may have different perspective, different aspirations as compared to your own country. So we have to understand the region. Understand the region, you have to understand the region as a grouping, as a whole, the region as the individual countries, the region, how, in terms of how it interacts with other external powers. And also, you have to know the regional institutions that play a role in the regional context. That is very much important. The second point under this regional perspective, you have to be engaged regionally. What I mean regionally is not just you have to be back and forth with the region, but you have to know the depth of the thinking and interests of the region. And after you have a lot of engagement with the region, you have to do the follow-up. Keep follow-up. Keep doing the follow-up. That is very much important. And another point, you are offshore major power. Why you consider yourself as a resident of the Pacific? You have to sustain your engagement and credibility. This is very much important in engaging and understanding the region. The fourth point I want to share with you is related to foreign affairs versus non-governmental environment. I will just highlight 2 points. Point number 1 is related to your home country. As someone in the foreign service, you are part of the political hierarchy at home. And you have to own the back and forth, pull and push in interactions with the home country as part of the political hierarchy. And another point is that youngcomer to the foreign service, you will be lower down at the political hierarchy. So you have to move up. In order to move up, you have to do small things and step by step. Point number 2 at home is that you are part of the policy making related to foreign affairs. And number 3 at home is that you must be under public scrutiny. This is very much important. You have influenced by the people at home while you are advocating and a policy for your countries in the region. And another point under this foreign affairs versus non-governmental position is that you will be working in a government-to-government environment in an external context. Even at home when you receive guests or over telephone call with your dialogue partners or whatever, you are always working in a government-to-government context. This is typically the 2 points that I want to share with you with regard to foreign affairs versus non-governmental relations. My 5th point is about America and how it is seen as in relations to the world and Southeast Asia. My perception of this is that, or what I understood, correct me if I'm wrong, the US has been recognized and has seen itself as a major power. Sometimes its own concerns seems to be the world concerns, but not always so. This is what you have to think when you are dealing with other regions of the world. You focus on your own way and you think it's correct for everybody. That is sometimes a perception of a big power. Number 2 is that As a big power, you have a wide range of concerns globally. Why the region is so narrow, much more to the region itself. So the priority in the region sometimes compared to your wide range of global priorities, so have to fit in that one. As a major power, you always think, or very much often think, domestic issue first. And that can seem to be justified when you are doing the external job, foreign affairs job. This is sometimes, for example, if you think that your values and standards to be shared or to be imposed, this is the type of perceptions that you have to face when you interact with other countries in the region. Another point why I call America versus the world and Southeast Asia. As a major power, you often put things in the perspective of major power, politics, and competition. Sometimes competition between the major powers are clear-cut in two ways, but sometimes it's mixed as major powers and interact with each other interdependently. So my word here is that we should not think just of a binary choice between one and the other, what I call this versus that. Then there's a long range of issues in between this and that we can do together, not just push to one side versus the other. You can see that very correctly when you put yourself in Southeast Asia in the context of the current situation of US-China competition. All things have changed in comparison to the old days of the Cold War with the Soviet Union. The US and China, even you both are competing, you are interdependent, and you are still trading with each other. You are still engaging with each other. So competition is not something to exclude engagement. So for other countries, it's more so as well. So we have to very much focus on that. The question of this versus that nowadays, especially in the context of US-China competition, is not something of clear-cut borders. This is something. My sixth point is about Southeast Asia and its nuances. Southeast Asia has been since long more complex than you may think, much more dynamic and diverse. And even you think of the colonial times, some 7 decades or 8 decades ago, not any major power ever dominated Southeast Asia entirely. So the region is open to engagement with major powers, open or know to or accustomed to major power competition, but not to be dominated entirely by one country ever since. So this is one point that I want you to recognize. Another point is that Southeast Asia, in the context of US-China, the two most important partners of the region and two most important players in the region. In the context of US-China, sorry, I stood slow. In the context of US-China competition, we in Southeast Asia think both of you, US and China, are very much important partners of the region. So the level of importance varies between or among countries in Southeast Asia. The second point is that, but as we think both of US and China are important, none of us in the region is 100% with either with the US or China. Some may have 70% with the US, some may have 70% of with China, but not. So the policies that we call here is something like to hash, to dodge, to balance, and to bandwagon. But one thing I want you to recognize that we do all these things together at the same time. That is the nuances of Southeast Asia. So you see, sometimes we are too much in favor of investment from China. That doesn't mean that we are 100% with China. We need the US. We need the US presence in Southeast Asia as both in terms of deterrence and balance. But also you are playing a positive and constructive role in engaging Southeast Asia as well. So let's see how ASEAN works with the US regional architecture with regard to the South China Sea issue, with regard to peace, and also we are looking for the summit to be hosted by President Biden, I think in the middle of this year, sometime between 12 and 13 of this month. And this will be very much important, and a lot of interactions between the leaders of the region and the US leader. This is very much important. I think whatever the rise of China may be later on, the US has unique role here in the region. And the US need to look into Southeast Asia and individual countries of how it interact with the competition between the US and China. That is very much an important one. So I will stop here. My conclusion is 2 points. As a diplomat, you work in foreign affairs or you are doing the diplomacy things. Diplomacy starts first at home. And I tell you, this is very tough job. Now, with regard to the region, my recommendation is that you need to engage regionally, bring regional input into the national perspective and sell your voice and stay engaged with the region credibly. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Ambassador. That was a really excellent overview of the ways in which one, as a diplomat needs to juggle and really stay abreast of both domestic and regional interests and changes, and selling one's own country as well as selling the region at home. So we will, without further ado, move on to Frank Januzzi.
Thank you very much, Meredith. And it's really an honor to appear alongside such distinguished scholars and diplomats, and I appreciate this opportunity to share a few thoughts. My task is to think a little bit about how scholars, students, those who want to have a voice with your government, especially the US government, can be heard, and how to think about one's career, how to think about the training and the field experience and the work that can lead to an effective life of both scholarship and hopefully public policy, advocacy, and impact on issues that you care about. So in thinking about that and lessons learned from my own life, I just want to underscore a few points, and then really look forward to a conversation with you and questions that you may have about how to pursue a career particularly in Southeast Asian studies or in US Southeast Asian engagement. And my first bit of advice is that to be effective in Asian studies and to be an effective, engaged citizen on issues that you care about in US-Asia relations, you need both a regional focus and some kind of substantive discipline. In my case, I studied history because I like stories, and because when I was an undergraduate, I had a lot of professors who were really good storytellers, like Jonathan Spence and Paul Kennedy. And so if you like stories, history is a great discipline, but you may prefer economics or engineering or business. It doesn't really matter, but you should have a discipline about which you are somewhat well-informed. But then you need to marry that, I think, if you want to care about, in my case, Asia, with regional understanding. And that is best gained through a combination, I think, of book learning and language study and field experience. And there's really no substitute for being in the region and for being on the ground. During my whole life in government, which spanned about 23 years, I learned more in 2 weeks in the Philippines on Mindanao than I would have learned in the previous 3 years, trying to keep well informed about what was happening in the Philippines from Washington, D.C. And the months I was able to spend in places like Cambodia or visiting Thailand and working in a refugee camp on the Thai-Cambodia border, those months were the equivalent of years of sort of reading good journalist reports, reading books, talking to smart people in Washington, D.C. So you need that blend, ideally. And again, I would say complement your weaknesses by pursuing studies in the areas that are hard for you. In my case, it was economics, econometrics, statistics. None of those came naturally to me, but you should try to build on your weaknesses rather than just building on your strengths. It's very easy to build on your strengths, but it's going to make you more narrow and less able to engage with people who are important, who are expert in fields that are outside of your area of expertise. And if you can at least learn enough to be conversant in their language, you're going to be a more effective scholar and a more effective advocate if that's what life brings you. For Americans especially, I want to say that field experience in Asia is essential. It's essential not only because your ability to really get a good feel for Asia while residing only in the United States will necessarily be limited, no matter how aggressively you pursue a good education and talking to foreign students on your campus or learning from wonderful professors who are visiting from overseas. But it's especially important if you want to be an effective voice and have impact. When I was working on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the chief counsel of our committee was a guy named Brian McEwen, who is now the Deputy Secretary of State. And Brian was in charge often of what's called a conference committee, where the House and the Senate staff would get together to try to work out differences in legislation. And whenever there was a fight over a House and Senate version of a piece of legislation that had something to do with East Asia, Brian would call me over. And to be brutally frank, he didn't really care what I was going to say. He would call me over because, unlike most of the House staff members that we were negotiating with, I had probably just returned from Asia. So if we were debating an aid bill on how much U.S. foreign assistance was going to go to the Philippines, Brian would call me over and he'd say, "Now, Frank, you're just back from Philippines. What did you see there?" Or, "Oh, we're going to be debating North Korean human rights. Frank, you're just back from Pyongyang. You visited some orphanages and schools. You had some conversations. What did you see there?" And that credibility of on-the-spot, knowledge carries the day over other forms of expertise, especially on Capitol Hill. But really across Washington, there's nothing that quite compares with the authenticity that one can present if you have field experience. When you're talking to government and you want to try to be effective, you might be a student and you want to bring an idea to someone in government to solve a problem. You might be an advocate like Sidney Jones at Human Rights Watch, and you're trying to change government policy. One needs to understand what moves government to action. And that depends really on who the constituents are of whatever part of the government you're talking to. So for 15 years of my life, I worked on Capitol Hill in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And Capitol Hill, believe it or not, is not really driven by money. I know people think that it is. It's not. It's driven by constituents, by votes. And members of Congress want to get reelected. The first thing that Senator Biden said to me when I started working for him in 1997, on the job training, he said, "Frank, what does 302 mean to you?" And I thought it was a provision of sanctions legislation, and there is a 302 provision of law that's relevant to sanctions. He said, no. 302 is Delaware telephone area code. When your phone rings and it as 302 as the caller ID, pick up the damn phone. because if you don't pick up the phone, I won't be reelected. And if I'm not reelected, you'll be out of a job. So constituent driven is the way that Congress works. And Congress also has what's called the rule of three, which is that if one person contacts you and they are a constituent, let's say from Delaware, you can safely ignore them because they're probably a crazy person. If two people contact you, you can probably ignore them also because it's a crazy person and their best friend. But if three people contact you from Delaware, they get a meeting because three people is a movement. Three people is an indication that something important is going on about which the member of Congress probably needs to be informed. So that's more important than money. Democracy actually does work. You don't have to be a donor, to have a voice. It's different in the executive branch. The executive branch is not elected directly by the people. They're not going to meet with ordinary people unless those people are bringing something to the executive branch that is directly relevant to the executive branch's ability to do its work. So with the executive branch, more than with Congress, it's a quid pro quo. It's what are you bringing to me that's going to help me be more effective in my job? And in exchange, I might do something for you. And I think Sydney knows this well, but I mean, what NGOs often bring to government that government needs is information, reliable information, good, credible field information, stuff that they don't know that is relevant to what they're trying to accomplish. And you need to make sure that you're bringing the right information to the right people. So you don't bring sanctions information to the Department of Commerce because the Department of Commerce enjoys doing business and they're not really in the business of wanting to strengthen sanctions. But if you're talking to OFAC, the office at the Treasury Department in charge of sanctions, well, they're very excited about information that might be relevant to their ability to enforce sanctions. So you have to do your homework and understand to whom you're speaking. But depending on what part of the government apparatus you want to engage, you have to have an appreciation for what their job is. And you have to realize that what's important to you may not be important to them if it's not within their purview, if it's not a task that they have responsibility for performing. It might be fascinating, it might be super interesting, it might be something really important, but it's not important to them. So you need to find the right person to whom to speak, who has both an interest in the topic, but also responsibility for handling that topic. Finally, I want to give you a little sense of what I call the Washington solar system. As someone who's worked in US-Asia relations for a long time, I feel that it's important to approach the level of interest that folks have with a sense of humility and an understanding that the fascination that you have as a student or as an NGO worker or as a business person, or a journalist, the fascination that you have for a particular region and topic may not always be shared, right? You have to find a way to make it relevant to the people to whom you're speaking. And if you want to do that, you have to have a sense of what I call the Newtonian physics of Washington, D.C. And I'll just take 90 seconds, I hope, to try to blast through this. So think of Washington as a solar system where the sun is the center of energy and warmth and resources and light. That, of course, is the Oval Office. And this solar system is governed by Newtonian physics, which means that the influence of every part of the system is a product of both its mass, its size, right? But also it's the square of the distance between it and the sun. So the closest body to the sun is a very small planet, Mercury. It's messenger of the gods. That's the National Security Council. It's really tiny, but it's close to the sun. It has a lot of, it's trapped in the sun's orbit and it carries messages from the sun to the outer planets, right? Just outside of Mercury, we've got 3 planets that are all very important. One is Mars, that's the god of war, that's the Pentagon, right? It's a little further out from the sun, carries out the missions of national defense. Venus, the goddess of love, that's the State Department, of course, because their job is to make friends with everybody. There are no enemies, only friends yet to be made. And the third planet in this group is Earth. Earth may surprise you on foreign affairs. It's the Treasury Department. Treasury Department has resources. It's a lot more important in foreign affairs than most people think it is, and that's the Earth. Where I spent a lot of my career further out is this giant gas giant. It's so big that it has its own moons. It's full of hot air and gaseous windbags. That's the Congress, right? Jupiter. And Jupiter is so huge, it has its own ecosystem, it has its own gravitational forces around it, but it's pretty far away from the sun, and its impact on the sun on foreign policy is diminished by the square of the distance it is from the Oval Office. And it's a long way from the Oval Office, and its impact, therefore, is limited, especially on foreign affairs. I won't talk a lot about the outer planets. They're inhabited by folks with minimal impact, like Mansfield Foundation or Amnesty International. But Neptune, Uranus, Pluto, these outer planets are of very little consequence, except when they align themselves. If they can get themselves all in alignment and sort of pool their gravitational forces of think tanks and NGOs and citizens groups and advocacy groups, then they can have some impact. Their combined mass is sufficient to pull the Earth a little bit in its orbit, or tweak the sun a little bit. I share all of this with you just as a way of admonishing you that as you as a student are thinking about careers in whatever field, if it comes a time when you want to interact with Washington and policymakers, know your audience, present views that are important to what they do, not just what you think is important. Know what planet they're on, right? Because if you know which planet they're on, then you're going to know which issue sets they might actually be able to have an impact on and how they fit together in that Washington solar system, right? And bring to that discussion a combination of real knowledge of a discipline, whether it's political science or economics or science of climate change or how to build good infrastructure and high-speed rail. It could be engineering, but bring to that discussion knowledge of a discipline augmented by meaningful field research, language, area studies, area experience. And if you do those things, you will be able to be successful in interplanetary travel. You can work at one planet and then maybe move to another one. In my case, I've moved steadily outwards from the inner circles outward to the point of irrelevance. Maybe you want your career trajectory that is moving from the outer planets toward the sun rather than vice versa. But in my case, it's been perfectly fun for me to move gradually out from inner circles to outer circles. But it's possible to move among those planets if you equip yourself with the right skill sets. Thank you, Meredith.
Thanks, that was great. So we see all the different considerations to think through in preparing oneself for a career in Asia-focused foreign affairs. Really how to think through what part of the government apparatus most appeals and what sort of accountability that would entail, and how to make what's relevant to you relevant to others in the political solar system. And I have to say, I love the that solar system metaphor for government and foreign affairs and where one on what planet one might sit. I hate to think of where academia is, somewhere out in an asteroid. Anyway, all right, moving on, we turn to Cindy Jones.
Thank you very much. And I think much of what I will say builds on the two previous speakers. And I found it actually amazing how much my own thoughts and recommendations jibed with both the ambassador and with commentary. The critical point, if you're dealing with sensitive information, and I've worked on human rights, conflict, and extremism, and it's hard to get very much more sensitive than that, is this idea of making sure your information is credible, because everything you do is going to stand on that. And that means that you've got to be extremely careful in knowing your sources. You've got to make sure that you understand the biases that are inherent in the people you talk to. And if you understand the biases, you can compensate for those by getting as many different perspectives as possible. It's interesting to remember, and this is one of the things that I tell my staff over and over and over, is that you can't take any information on face value, at face value. You can't even take information or testimonies from victims at face value, because in some cases, there are going to be very good reasons why they may want to massage facts as well. One example is refugee communities. Most refugee communities are in very critical situations. If they're in a camp, for example, sometimes they're under the control of a camp commander. If you try to interview them, they're going to be concerned about who else is listening. And it's often impossible to take them aside and just meet them one-to-one, which is something that's always recommended when you're doing these kinds of interviews. But also, they're terrified of being sent back or going back. And that means that sometimes they're going to exaggerate the data that they actually present of abuses or of suffering. So especially when it comes to numbers. So you've got to be absolutely skeptical as you approach any source, and then try to find reinforcing materials or something that can add to the data that you actually get from interviews. How you present that information is also critical. So you need to be able to make not only a credible case that you've got up-to-date and reliable information, but you've got to make sure that you're presenting it in as objective a form as possible. One of the things that as human rights defenders, we have a major task of doing is ensuring that we're not seen as solidarity groups with a particular guerrilla group or a particular political party or any other group. You've got to present material in as objective a form as possible. Also, it's important to note that guerrillas or governments also often exaggerate or downplay particular facts. So understanding those biases, knowing your sources and so on is critical. But then you have to present it in an effective way. So in addition to having good research skills, having good communication skills is critical. And in almost any NGO job you're going to have, there's going to be an element of writing reports. And you have to have the writing skills to be able to tell a coherent and credible narrative. It's got to have a beginning and it's got to have an end and it's got to go somewhere. So another thing that I tell my staff is forget about theory. Anything you were taught in university about theory or about needing to present a theoretical perspective first, forget it. Nobody's going to read that. You've got to start with the facts and let the facts tell the story. And you can draw conclusions from those facts later, but start with the facts. Also, you need to be able to articulate what you want to have happen in policy terms, both orally and in writing. And people forget sometimes that conveying things orally can be just as important, especially if you're going to Frank or going to someone where you're advocating a particular policy recommendation. You've got to be concise. I used to coach groups coming through from Indonesia when I was at Human Rights Watch, when we were going to talk to Frank or other people in Washington. And the first point was, don't give them a litany of your experience or your suffering or the abuses that you've suffered, because generally the people you're talking to know that, and they don't want to hear endless repetitions of that. But they are going to say to you, what do you want us to do? And you've got to have 3 bullet points that are practical, doable, and and necessary to actually bring about change. If you've got those bullet points that you can articulate in order, that means you can also write op-eds. It means that you can translate your oral presentation to a written presentation. And one of the things that you will need to practice is presenting short materials in writing so that you don't try to go through a dissertation or you don't try to present a thesis, but you think in terms of a 700-word or 750-word op-ed to make your point. If you can do that in writing, you can probably do it orally. And that makes a real difference when you're trying to advocate a particular point. One of the other things that you have to remember in dealing on sensitive issues is that you can't please everybody. There's going to be no way you can avoid making enemies or at least confronting a hostile audience. So you've got to have a thick skin. You do have to understand who you're talking to. You may be critical of a particular government or agency or even fellow NGOs, but you've got to know that when you make that case, you're going to be encountering criticism, disbelief, and skepticism, and you've got to have a way of overcoming that. One of the things that changed for me when I went from being at Human Rights Watch in New York to living in Jakarta and working with an advocacy organization there is that it makes a real difference when you can actually talk to the people that you're advocating to. So that when I look back at Human Rights Watch, I found many of our previous recommendations too shrill because we never expected we could actually talk to the people who were the target of our recommendations. But when you can talk to the police, when you can talk to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, when you can talk to other parts of the government, you change your tone. You change the way you approach those individuals, and you can make a much more persuasive case as a result. So it gets back to the point about knowing your audience, knowing your constituencies, but also being able to articulate very specific goals. In terms of the background of going into human rights organizations or other advocacy NGOs, it's across the board, but as Frank underscored, having a proven commitment and proven regional expertise is really key. At Human Rights Watch, a lot of people came from legal backgrounds, from international human rights law, but there were also journalists because writing is so critical and journalists understand how to write short, coherent pieces to deadlines. There were also a lot of people who came from political science or international relation backgrounds, but almost everyone who worked on some aspect of international affairs did have field experience. How do you get that? One of the best ways is to look for internships. And then on your CV, if you have low paid or unpaid volunteer work or internships in the area where you're going to be working, that looks really good. It's both evidence of commitment to the region as well as commitment to the specific field that you're going to be working in. And UN in most international offices offer internships, whether it's UNICEF or UNHCR or UNDP. You might not want to have careers in those organizations, but it's a wonderful stepping stone to sell yourself to other agencies as a person that actually made a substantial step to go overseas and understand the region there. I think the other critical issues are language expertise. So if you can deepen your own knowledge of a particular language, that always looks good. If you can take a public speaking class, do that. It's always useful because not everyone is a natural public speaker. And if you can take a writing course in addition to whatever else, what other training you get, that can also be of critical help in learning how to present a coherent narrative. Thank you.
Terrific, thanks. So here we have, we can start to see how these pieces all fit together, but the need to be a critical and skeptical consumer of information in the process of advocacy work, knowing enough about your sources and the context in which they operate and live to be able to judge their credibility or how and why they might skew data, which can be perfectly reasonable for them to do, how to garner expertise oneself, including language expertise, and how to present information to communicate the policy goals you recommend orally and in writing. So all of these as being key, and that is a perfect segue to Prashant Parameswaran. So I turn it over to you, Prashant.
Great, thanks so much, Meredith, and thanks so much for the team. And it's really good to be on this panel. And as Sydney just mentioned, it's going to be, a lot of this is going to blend with the previous presentation. So I'll try to minimize overlap and also leave a lot of time for questions and discussion. So I think, in terms of writing, and writing especially for a policy audience rather than an academic or media audience, as I think all our speakers have mentioned previously, the critical point is just knowing your audience, just making sure that you are able to, and I always recommend when you're thinking about writing, the first step is to ask yourself, should I write something or not? I think on some topics and some issues, the first thing you have to ask yourself is, what is your objective? Are you trying to influence a particular policy? Are you trying to develop expertise in a particular area? Are you trying to publish because you want to build up your publication record, which I always recommend folks to be cautious about. You want to build your publication record, but you also want to make sure that you are contributing something that's of value. Having been an editor in my previous life, I can safely say, within a few seconds of glancing at a piece, I can already tell whether somebody really wants to say something or whether they just want to get published in a publication and they're looking to just, check off something in a requirement or something that they have to do. So that's extremely important, asking yourself what your objective is. And then I think, there are a couple of steps that I think are really helpful if you want to write something, what to do before you write. I think the first is to visualize your audience. And the practice I use is imagine a very specific person, where they're sitting and what they're doing in their day-to-day job. So if you're writing a piece about strengthening US-Malaysia relations, which is the 350th piece that's been written on this subject in 10 or 15 years, with a lot of people who are a lot more qualified to write about that, the question you should ask yourself is, what is the State Department desk officer thinking about this and already doing? What is the embassy, the US Embassy in Malaysia thinking about this? What is the Malaysian government thinking about how to improve relations with the US? What is the US government, the National Security Council thinking about this? And then if you can answer all those questions and kind of put yourself in those people's shoes, then you can come up with a set of recommendations that perhaps these folks are not seeing, right? So a good example, the US ASEAN Summit, we're going to see probably a flood of op-eds coming out in the next 2 or 3 weeks about the US needs to do X, the US needs to do Y. The question you have to ask yourself if you're writing about this is, do you have something unique to say? And maybe you do. Maybe it's not about security, it's not about business, it's about diversity. And diversity, equality, and inclusion, and these are challenges that are faced by both the United States and Southeast Asia, and these are actually the 3 agenda items that you should consider. In which case, if you're thinking about it, you have to ask yourself, the other question is the timing, right? We're in a place right now where a lot of the deliverables are already being worked out. Even if there's a statement that's being issued, you have to ask yourself, is it more of a value add to do it before or to do it after? What is the process of implementation? And that gets to my second point, which is once you visualize the conversation and you visualize the actors, you want to ask yourself, what has already been written and what has already been done and what are people saying about it? The only way to do that is you can read what has happened before, you can read the official statements, but there's no substitute for talking to actual people who are involved in the policymaking process. And it's important to do that beforehand because those are presumably the people you're going to try to influence. And if you write a piece and you're trying to influence those guys and they say, well, we already considered these ideas 3 years ago, this person not read what we're actually thinking about it and not know where the policy context and conversation is. And this is really important because it's a very crowded landscape these days in media, right? So 10 or 15 years ago, you could have probably said the same thing, but you have now media outlets like Axios, for example, that are telling us on a regular basis how little people's attention spans are, right? The number of people that make it down to the end of a 800-word op-ed, we know is like under 5%. So if you're the old format of like, let's talk about the context and then the policy recommendations in the last 3 lines, it's not going to work. You probably want to make the case very clearly and engage your readers up top. Then I would say really important to structure what you're writing, what arguments you're trying to convey, and to plan what you're actually engaging in terms of your pitch plan, right? So who do you want to write for? Who do you want to engage? And then what kind of outlets? So if you're, say writing about an issue, say on the Southern Thailand insurgency, right? Which again, like thousands upon thousands of articles have been written on this. The question you have to ask yourself is, what in terms of the timing do you want to look at? Are you going to aim for a newspaper in Thailand? Are you going to try to influence Malaysia and try to do that way? Do you want to influence a US or international audience? If it's Thailand, which newspaper? If it's Malaysia, what newspaper? And you want to be very careful about, the Diplomat is an excellent publication, but there's a very different audience set that you're going to get from there relative to where you're going to get from a local newspaper. And also, frankly, these days, especially if you're not writing in the local language, you're already losing a significant portion of the reader base. So if you're writing about Indonesia, you're writing about Malaysia, you're writing about Cambodia, and you lose, you sort of write in English, you're losing the entire part of the local population that speak the native language. And governments know that, and that's why they have different regulations around newspapers that are written in certain languages versus others, right? So you have to be very careful about the outlet that you're suggesting as well. And then I would say, with respect to how to get there, so I've talked about the process in terms of writing. How do you deal with that? I would say always ask yourself the big question, which is, when you're writing something, what is the value add that you're contributing? And that, if you don't have a value add, my thing is don't write it. And there's various other mediums, right? So you could have a conversation, you could participate in a podcast, you could, do any number of things that don't involve actually writing something that is publicized. And in this environment where everybody knows and monitors what you're writing, in 10 years from now, people could be referring back to what you wrote, right? So you want to be very careful about what you're trying to say. And then I think, it's really important as well, as you're planning through your writing journey, to build relationships with individuals. Building relationships with editors is really important, because institutions are places you submit, but you really don't want to be submitting it to, publication, at publication.org or .com, because that's just, it's gonna be very difficult for you to actually get a response. But if you can build relationships with individual editors, some of whom may be a little bit kinder and gentler than others who just say, I don't really have time for X or don't have time for Y, that's really important. And then also, building your own reputation and platform. One of the things I always remind people is, I'll just use my own personal example. I was extremely frustrated when I started writing that I had to go through sort of the gatekeepers. And so what I did was I started my own blog, and I just started writing. And there's actually more mediums that you can do it. Everybody else has their own Substack newsletter right now. You have Twitter, you have all these social media outlets. So I would say the other thing is, if you don't have luck in these publications that are very established, just start writing. Start writing, have well-informed facts, ask yourself what your value add is, and be brave about that. Develop your own platform. And then what happens is you'll find other publications will come to you on certain issues that you're writing about. And that's an actually great way to see what of the content that you're producing is actually sticking, right? Is it the piece that you're writing on, foreign affairs? Is it domestic politics? Is it security? Is it supply chains? That's a really good way for you to figure out what's happening. So I would say, don't get bogged down by this sort of, I wrote for foreign policy and then accept my article. Frankly, I can't, I've lost count of how many failures I've had in terms of articles I've submitted to various publications. But the key thing is to just stick with it. And if you're really passionate about something, ask yourself what your strengths are, as Frank was saying, where are you best placed to contribute, and then develop a sort of pattern of expertise, field experience, and then getting to know the right people to be able to position yourself for the right thing. And one thing I always say is, when you're writing something, make sure that don't assume that people know what your networks are and the research you're doing. Always tell them the hard work that you do. Don't assume that. And also really don't assume, particularly in Washington, that people even know basic things like, Malaysia carried out an exercise with Indonesia last week. They may well not know that. So don't undersell your expertise, particularly if you have expertise on the ground and field research. It's definitely, and it works the other way too. If you're writing about the US for a Southeast Asia audience, don't assume that they know all of the things that Frank mentioned about, the solar system, the dynamics of Congress, and all of that. People may not know actually what's going on. So it's really important to ask yourself in that sense, what value add you're contributing in that respect as well. So I'll close there and look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Fantastic. These were just such great remarks. I look forward to making my students listen to this. So here we had issues of writing for a policy audience, to know your audience, what they already know, what they're thinking, their interests, what you can offer that's unique and adds value while remaining succinct and on point, being enterprising if you need, so long as you still have the facts and the analytical punch, and both having and communicating expertise. So we'll open to Q&A. I'm going to start with a question for any of the panelists or all the panelists. Others, feel free to raise your digital hand or put questions in the chat if you prefer. Raising a physical hand, I'm unlikely to see it, just given the vagaries of Zoom. But do feel free to ask questions. If you've come late to the panel, that's fine as well. You can still ask a question. So what I'll start us off with, though, is I'm curious how the never-ending, it seems, COVID pandemic environment has changed some of the pathways and communications and best practices you've all described might be. So we have Sydney's recommendation of talking directly with those to whom you're advocating. Prashant's discussion of talking with people in the policy world and really building relationships. Ambassador Vin discussed some very similar things in terms of balancing and representing the regional or domestic, which can be easier in person than over Zoom. And Frank's discussion is which Sydney and Prashant also touched on, of the necessary value of time in the field. So are there stopgap remedies you can suggest for those who are just getting started on their career and don't yet have that time in the field, for instance, or better ways than just the standard WebEx or Zoom meeting to build those relationships and make those connections, whether it be with editors or with policymakers or with subject matter experts in the field or in the US? Okay, Sydney.
One of the ways that we dealt with COVID when we couldn't go to the field was to rely on primary documents. So particularly if you have access to documents that others don't, that gives you a basis for reporting that can be as fresh or as innovative as when you went to the field to do interviews. In our case, it was particularly getting access to trial documents, and in some cases, interrogation testimonies. And these were unique. They were gold mines of information. You have to be careful, of course, in understanding what the potential sources of disinformation are in these documents. But that's one way that we dealt with COVID.
Great. Others from the panel?
Can I say something? For example, in ASEAN, we have been working with each other for many meetings here and there, and we have a group of old friends. So what I call it is that friends of friends, even you will have to work through Zoom, via Zoom, then you ask your friends here and there to introduce friends, and that will also develop a kind of credibility and trust before you go into the room. But certainly some of the sensitive issues, you can have a drafting exercise, but you cannot build up progress, such as the South China Sea issue. It's very tough if we do not have person-to-person meeting. Thank you.
I'm just curious if I can follow up on that just one bit, and then I'm happy to turn to Frank or Prashant. But in as much as it's hard to progress, so where does that leave you? I don't know if is there a concrete example that you could give that you're able to say aloud of how you've managed to work around that, especially again thinking through the fact that of those I recognized on the Zoom, some are graduate students who are just beginning. They don't have yet friends of friends that in the same numbers.
Actually, you can have the teachers, the professors introduce somebody to you and build a range of friends through the core group of friends. Many ways you can do that. And sometimes even someone you didn't know before, but you knew already on social media, and you have a conversation over the internet for quite some time, and there's some type of relationship already developed online. That is also a friend that I got. Thank you.
Great. Okay, thanks. And I didn't mean to put you on the spot. Okay, Frank,
I would just underscore the ambassador's comment. Look, everything is harder right now, and it's going to stay hard compared to where it was, I think, because I don't think we're ever going to have quite the same level of normalcy that we enjoyed. But I think friends of friends is really great advice. And most of the introductory meetings or mentoring or consultations that I've had over the last 2 years have come about that way. Someone has contacted me and said, "Hey, I've got this bright student or grad student, would you mind chatting with them?" So go to your profs, as a first resource. And then they might go to someone they know, and you might end up having a secondary introduction. But don't think that it's impossible. But on the other hand, don't underestimate the challenge. It's hard. When I worked on Capitol Hill before January 6th and before COVID, Capitol Hill was completely open, and Sidney Jones could wander the halls and knock on my door without an appointment. And she did sometimes. No, she was very careful. She would always call at first. But the point is, in the course of wandering around Capitol Hill, there could be a casual encounter, just almost by chance. Well, that doesn't happen anymore. You can't walk into any Capitol Hill building now without an appointment. I think it's a tragedy that our government is so walled off, now from people, but that's the way it is. So we just have to adapt. But I think the ambassador's advice is very strong.
Great. Prashant, did you want to add anything or?
Yeah, just a couple of things. I mean, I would say one is, yes, I absolutely agree. COVID's made a lot of things difficult. I would also say I have received, myself just personally, like a number of, emails from students just sort of asking, "Hey, are you willing to meet? If not in person, perhaps virtually." And I think that approach, I've used it a little bit as well. It might actually be easier now, particularly if it's Southeast Asia, US, to generate those and those don't substitute for in-person meetings, obviously, but just to build that network initially. And I would say the other thing is, when you do attend virtual events, it's even more important now I've lost count of how many young professionals will come up to me after an event, after the Q&A, and sort of say, "Hey, I thought this was really interesting." And I said, why didn't you bring it up in the Q&A session when, there was another experienced Washington insider who spent about 10 minutes talking about a comment rather than a question, right? So I would say it's really important to speak up. Don't assume that because you're present in an event, people know that you have expertise, particularly in Washington, but I will also say generally that it's really important to do that.
Yeah, and just to echo that last point about speaking up and asking the questions in the Q&A and that sort of thing. It's also, if you have a question, chances are good that others have the same question and may also not be asking it. Okay, that said, I'm going to pose one other question to the panel, taking advantage of my position as moderator. And that is, it just came up now that the issue of social media, and that this can be a source of, as Ambassador Vin said, of friends in a loose sense. But I'm curious about, especially thinking of Prashant's comments about maintaining, a blog or other ways of getting your policy work out there. Any tips that you might have for maintaining a social media presence that will help to advance a policy career? Thinking of that balancing that a couple of you have mentioned of objectivity, as Sydney noted, for instance, along with advocacy, of communicating expertise without seeming, like you also lack all hubris and that sort of thing. So, how to do that well, or what to avoid. It can just be, top tips of do's and don'ts, or more specific things that have worked for any of you. Sydney?
Yeah, I think one thing that worked for me was building the Twitter audience through non-advocacy issues. So I didn't even realize this was going to happen, but during an Indonesian presidential election, I live tweeted comments throughout that, and suddenly I found myself with 6,000 new supporters on Twitter, new followers. And then they could then be an audience for policy papers that I then put forward. So you might think about how to build your audience apart from the issues that you're specifically engaged in. Got to be careful doing that, by the way. But then use the audience that you've built for more directly policy-related goals.
Great. Other suggestions?
I would say, just to add to what Sydney said, it's really important. I mean, you'd be surprised sometimes that you're sort of mentioning an event or you're participating in something. You never really know what takes off, because it could really just go viral. And also, it's important as well to ask yourself what your objective is when you're using channels. So, if you have a different strategy for, say, Twitter versus LinkedIn versus Facebook, and all these platforms, are all undergoing various changes, as we saw with Elon Musk recently. So it's going to change. It's not going to remain the same. But I think, like, asking yourself, are you using your channel perhaps? Some of the social media accounts I follow them, even as simple for a reason as this is a person who compiles or collates really good articles on X subject or Y subject. Or there might be another person who's really good at advertising thought leadership from people that I follow, right? And so you could build a reputation just by being an excellent peer who shares other people's information. And then when you have your own book come out or your own op-ed, that benefits you, in addition to being a nice thing to do, obviously. But also, just there is so much, I can't emphasize this point enough, there's just so much stuff around. There is a role just to collate what is happening, and to be a guide through this universe. And I actually think the barriers to entry for that role are not as high as one would think. I mean, you don't have to have like 40 or 50 years of experience to be collating something on that. And it's a good place to start. I mean, just to tell people what's actually going on. And then you can actually build a reputation by saying, hey, listen, I've been monitoring, every week, these, a certain percentage of posts that I've seen have been focused on this rather than that. And you could start building an empirical database almost that makes you able to talk about that. And it gets to what, the ambassador was saying about the linkages between local, regional, and global, right? A lot of these events, you may find actually you're focusing on Southeast Asia, but there's a lot of interest maybe in Europe about the areas that you're focusing on, and other regions of the world as well.
Great. Okay. And I know that there's a question in the chat, and then also a question that was coming from the chat that will be asked by the individual. But I'll read out the question in the chat until the person who has a question is ready to raise their hand. This is from Zheng Wang, saying, I'm wondering if the panelists can talk more about the major differences between policy work and academic writing, particularly in terms of writing style and ways you communicate your ideas to audience. how should graduate students with limited experience in policy writing make our writing more engaging? And I wanted to add to that actually a question of like Sydney and Prashant in particular both address these sorts of issues, but are there specific resources you recommend for learning how better to communicate in writing or orally?
I don't know of any specific resources. I'm sure they exist, but I think one rule of thumb is to write as you would talk if you were making an argument. So read back what you've written and see if you would really say that in a public setting or even in a private setting, but try to be pointed but conversational.
Right.
And if I can build on that, I was so taken by Prashant, your visioning exercise that you go through when you're trying to think about, should I write something and who am I writing for? And you literally sort of, picture that person in their office or they're on their couch, how am I going to get this person's attention? I think it's really great advice, but I would say that for Sydney's point about, how is it going to sound, literally reading it out loud. If you're writing for a policy audience. And then I would say that if you're an academic and you're trying to tailor something for a policy audience, appreciate the fact that most of what, and Sydney already mentioned this, but most of what you might otherwise include in that article for the purposes of peer review that demonstrate that you've done your homework in doing the comparative literature and you've studied what other people have written. You are checking all the boxes theoretically that you're proving that you have rooted your analysis in the right political science doctrine that you studied in graduate school. None of that is relevant for the policy audience. The person who is reading it either believes in your credibility in your credentials or they don't. And so if they believe in your credentials, you don't need to prove it to them in terms of like, oh, I'm going to demonstrate all my theoretical knowledge. They want to get right to the point. When I was a staffer for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, my inbox of hard copy publications as well as emails was always full. And if it was a long paper, and by long I mean 10 pages, it rarely got read. I didn't have time. And if it was a short paper, I wanted it to, get right to the point about, what do you want me to do about it? What's the action channel? And I think, Ambassador, you probably have had a similar experience in the foreign ministry. You don't need to be persuaded of someone's expertise. Either they're credible or they're not in your mind. If they're not credible, you're not going to pick up the paper in the first place, right? But if they are credible, then you want them to get to the point and tell you what it is that you should be doing that you're not doing, or what you should know that you don't know. Is that right?
Sure.
Any final thoughts? Okay, Charmaine.
All right, so thank you all so much for this really great presentation. One of the questions that I still have, you've all talked a bit about knowing one's audience and also thinking about how to approach, for example, the US government specifically about policy. I was wondering if you had any suggestions about approaching Southeast Asian governments and any particular things to be aware of when one might do that.
Meredith, can I just jump in quickly because I have a Vietnam
Absolutely.
story to tell. I mean, the ambassador spoke eloquently about rooting his diplomatic work in knowledge of his own country and his country's positions, and that he couldn't be an effective diplomat without that. That's very important when engaging a Southeast Asian country as an American. You should know what the US interests are and what your country's goals are. But I think it's especially relevant in the case of Southeast Asia. that one needs to go into those conversations mindful of the power disparities and what those power disparities can engender in your audience. You know, if you're coming in as an American in Phnom Penh, and you're talking to, as I was once, Minister Sarkang, a Minister of the Interior at the time that I was meeting with him. Even though I was a lowly staffer, I was representing the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee of the US government. You know, and I'm meeting with an interior minister of a country of 12 or 13 million at the time, with a GDP, you know, roughly the size of Baltimore, Maryland, you know, and there's a huge power disparity. And I think it's really incumbent upon Americans in those situations to listen and be respectful, and to not put whoever it is you're speaking with in the position of being spoken at. You know, you're engaged in a dialogue, and it's got to be mutually respectful, and there's got to be some element of empathy involved. Where as an American in particular, dealing with Southeast Asia, so many Americans are not sufficiently mindful of our own history in Southeast Asia, you know, good and bad, you know, and so when I went to Amnesty International and wanted to help open the door to Vietnam for Amnesty International, wanted to be able to have Amnesty International personnel return to Vietnam for the first time after the Vietnam War. You know, I reached out first to folks in Vietnam, like Bui Thi Zang, who had been, you know, important in U.S.-Vietnam relations, to communicate my desire. Hey, you know, I want to come visit. I want to have a dialogue with your government on human rights issues on behalf of Amnesty. How do we make that happen? You know, not sort of saying like, and you better do it or else, you know, I'm going to get pissed. No, it's like, how do we achieve that mutual objective? So in speaking with Southeast Asian countries, be aware of the power disparities, be aware of the need to be especially empathetic to how those power disparities may play out in the minds of the people you're talking with. Listen, and then take a lesson maybe from Mike Mansfield. Mike Mansfield taught me never to impugn someone else's motive. You know, if you've got disagreements with people over policy, that's fine. You know, Amnesty International was very critical of Vietnam's human rights record in certain areas. But if you go into the conversation by saying, you know, why are you so eager to repress people's freedom of religion? Well, you're not going to get anywhere in that conversation. If you go in and you say, you know, let's talk about Vietnam's constitution and how your country can aspire to live up to the words in that document in the same way that the US is trying and sometimes succeeding and sometimes failing, you know, to live up to the words in our constitution and laws, you're more likely, you know, to get traction. It's what Sydney referred to earlier when she talked about the difference between the kind of style of engagement you have when you're talking to someone in person versus when you're just needing to communicate your frustration or your disappointment or your criticism of their track record, you know, and you're just putting that out there for the record. And that might be a little bit biting and it might be a little bit acerbic, right? But when you're actually trying to have a dialogue, you need to listen and be and not impugn motive. You know, most of the Vietnamese officials with whom I spoke began the conversation by reminding me that Ho Chi Minh was a human rights advocate on behalf of the Vietnamese people, and that the Vietnamese government didn't need to be lectured by anyone about caring about human rights, right? So I think it's, and you don't have to approach this with a credulous attitude either. You don't need to be naive. You know, if I'm sitting down with North Korean officials, and as I have, and if they're denying the existence of gulags or something, okay, well, you don't have to sort of say, oh, I'm so sorry that I got it wrong. I didn't realize you have no gulags. Well, no, they have political prisons. So you have to stick to your guns, but you root the conversation in evidence and in mutually respectful dialogue rather than in just, lobbing grenades, right? Or making accusations. And then I think finally, I'm sorry to be long-winded on this, but it's a subject that I really care deeply about, sort of the style, how one engages, but I think with Southeast Asia in particular, you really need to appreciate the diversity of the region. The conversation you have with a Singaporean, Oxford-educated, westernized diplomat, someone like, Bilahari or someone, is going to be a different conversation than the conversation you have with a village chief, in among the Kachin in northern Burma. It's going to be a different conversation, and you need to respect the diversity of experience across Southeast Asia. The religions, the languages, the faiths, the education, and don't have a one-size-fits-all approach, because what you do on Orchard Avenue in Singapore in terms of the kind of conversation is not the conversation you're going to have, in Naypyidaw or in Srok Baktye in Kampong Cham province in Cambodia, with a village leader there, who's never been out of his province, much less out of the country, So, yeah, you gotta do your homework and listen.
Can I just add one?
Yeah, go on.
Mm-hmm.
No, I was just going to say, at the risk of running over a few minutes, I'd love to hear a couple, if others have some remarks on this. And Frank has already actually started, even if inadvertently, also to address in the same vein, this question in the chat about the importance of understanding cultural context beyond transactional components and how to communicate that. So Sydney.
Okay, two things. One is that I think that in approaching Southeast Asian governments, you also have to recognize that each government is not monolithic, and that there are going to be very strong differences in perception if you're talking to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs versus the Ministry of Defense versus close advisors to the president. So just keep that in mind as well. And the second thing is to read up on whatever policies that government has taken toward the issue you're addressing. One short example is my colleagues in some of the human rights organizations tried to lobby the Indonesian government on speaking out more strongly against repression of Uyghurs in China, since Indonesia is the largest Muslim country in the region. And what they didn't realize and didn't appreciate is that for Indonesia, this was a separatist issue, and that if they spoke out on Uyghurs, they would open themselves up to receiving similar criticism on Papua. And that was one of the major reasons for the stance that Indonesia took, which was downplaying that issue. It also didn't want to get caught up in US-China concerns.
I would just add to that by saying two additional points, both of which have already been brought up. One is, for cultural context, I think making clear that you are investing in that country and the region more generally beyond your academic interests is really important. And I can't overestimate this. I mean, if you've been to other provinces outside of the capital in these Southeast Asian countries, even all of them, that creates a tremendous amount of credibility that also transcends beyond the governments that sit in the capital cities, and also shows that you actually care about these countries in the region other than for academic reasons, which hopefully you do. But I do think in addition to that, it's also important to establish that credibility. And then the second part is asking yourself, to Frank's point about empathy, how do you engage in two-way conversations and dialogue? So, my favorite example of this is, I think the US Embassy in Singapore conducted an event a few years ago, and I think what they wanted to address was issues of identity, ethnicity, and race in Singapore. But the way the embassy engaged in it was to first talk about the legacy of the United States and African Americans and marginalization. And then organically in the Q&A, what came up was Singaporeans themselves asking, oh, hey, this was your experience. This is how we can think about our own experience. So you don't necessarily have to go directly to criticizing flaws of countries and public forums. I think there's ways to engage in that conversation from the perspective of humility, but also make the same point. And I think those points need to be made. I think the only question is how to do it in a respectful, mutual manner.
Master Vin, as somebody who's been on the other side of that figurative table, anything you wanted to add? Yep. Okay. All right. I'm afraid we have actually gone over time, but thank you so much to our panelists for participating. These were just such fantastic comments and suggestions and really thoughtful remarks. We will have this posted online most likely today. We try to get these out very quickly. And so please don't be surprised if you find some of those graduate students you've said should be reaching out to people, reaching out to any of you to say, will you be my friend of friend? And help me build my mark in the policy field. So wherever all of you may be in that great solar system of policy work, I hope you have a great day. And thanks again to all of you for coming and for participating.